Welcome friends. In Indian economy unit number 5 we have been discussing industrial policy, and we talked about the scope of industrial policy, and then we took up for detailed discussion the industrial policy of 1956 and the industrial policy of 1991. You would recall that in the last session that we had, we basically talked about the industrial sickness in India, and we talked about how industrial sickness is defined, and then we moved over to the symptoms of industrial sickness. Now today is the time for us to discuss the causes. So we'll be discussing both the external as well as the internal causes. External causes basically are those causes which are outside the company, which are not under the control of the company, and internal causes would be those which are under the control of the company, which are because of factors within the company, right? So let us discuss external causes. First thing is recessionary trends. You know about business cycles, trade cycles, and you know that there are different stages including recovery, growth, prosperity. Then we have recession and depression. So whenever there is a recessionary trend, for example, if you talk about 2020, after the corona pandemic struck, there was a decrease in demand and a recession set in. In fact, India's GDP growth rate in the 2020-21 financial year was basically in the negative, which meant that the Indian GDP actually declined in 2020-21 as compared to 2019-20. Right, so this is an example of recession, and because of which so many companies suffer. During the recession phase, what happens is generally there is a decrease in demand, and if the demand is decreasing, naturally the various firms find it difficult to sell their product. So this is one reason they are not able to sell their product. There is less demand. Less demand is because people have less money to spend, and because the demand is less, the demand has declined. The ability of companies to sell their products also decline. These companies are not able to make sales. So this is one reason for industrial sickness. Then credit squeeze by banks. Many a times there is credit squeeze by bank. You have read in macroeconomics in your second semester. For example, when there is an increase in repo rate or reverse repo rate, generally banks tend to squeeze credit, which means they restrict the flow of credit to customers, to various business organizations. So this is what credit squeeze means. The interest rates increase, or there is less amount of money available with the banks to provide financing, to provide loans to customers as well as to organizations, business firms. Now this has a dual impact. First, since there is credit squeeze, what will happen? The customers, the retail customers, they would not be able to get loan easily, and since they do not get loan easily, they would not be able to purchase products on loan. For example, many a times we purchase cars, houses, mobile phones also on loans. So if the loan is not available or the interest rates are high because of the credit squeeze by banks, naturally the overall consumer demand would decrease, and then it may also lead to some kind of a recession at a later stage, and overall demand will decrease, and this will have an impact on the overall sales of the industrial enterprise. On the other hand, the industries would also find it difficult to obtain finance for their own expansion, or to purchase new machinery, or to have access to better technology. So they do not have access to loans, because of which they cannot purchase better technology, they cannot purchase better equipments, and ultimately their efficiency declines. So this is another manner in which the industrial enterprises have to suffer because of credit squeeze by banks. Then many a times industrial enterprises, they have to face problems because their customers who have already bought product from them, they delay the payments, they don't pay on time. And this also happens in case of bigger customers. For example, if there are smaller industrial enterprises which are selling to bigger brands, like for example if you are selling your product to Nestle, For example, you are a smaller unit and you are preparing packaging material and you are selling to Nestle. Now Nestle is a bigger brand, so Nestle will bargain for a longer credit period. Udhar, long, a longer credit period means the udhar will have to be paid after a certain amount of time, after a long amount of time. So now this credit period, once there is a demand from a dominant customer, the smaller enterprises have no option but to go by their demand, but to accede to their demand, and because of which their payments from the bigger customers get stuck. Since their payments from the bigger customer get stuck, what will happen? They will need more money to finance the next cycle of production. For example, if I'm selling packaging material today to Nestle and the Nestle is telling me that they would be only paying me 3 months down the line. So for these 3 months also, if I have to produce the packaging material for that, I will have to get more loans. My working capital requirement would increase basically. So this would first of all mean that I'll have to pay more interest because I'll get loans, working capital loans financed from some banks, and I'll have to pay interest on that. So this will reduce my profitability. So this is the major issue. And second is, naturally, if I'm not able to get back the money that is owed to me, if I'm not paid back the money by my customer, then many a times it may so happen that the customer does not pay the money altogether. So he does not only delay, but it does not at all pay the money to me. So in that case also, the credit which I had extended to my customer, that credit is not being returned by the customer. So this can be an example of a bad debt, where your money that is owed to you by somebody else is not coming back to you. So that also makes your business less viable, less profitable. And as I said, reputed and large customers have bargaining power. In fact, during the corona pandemic, so many PSUs, public sector enterprises, which had purchased items from smaller industries, so many PSUs were not paying for that purchase to smaller companies on time. And in fact, government came up with a directive for such PSUs to promptly make payments to their smaller suppliers. This was the reason why this particular directive was made. Delayed payments by customer, which could have led to industrial sickness of these smaller enterprises. Then many a times there are abrupt change in government policies, which also causes a problem. For example, only recently you might have seen that the government of India has made some changes in the telecom rules and regulations. Right now, these are abrupt changes, and because of which the various industrial firms find it very, very difficult to adjust their own processes and policies to match the change in the government policies and procedures. Is that fine? For example, you might have found out that so many automobile firms were not happy when the government changed the rules regarding environment pollution and implementation of Euro norms, Euro 5, Euro 4 and Euro 6 norms. So abrupt changes in government policies makes it difficult for the industrial units, industrial enterprises to accordingly bring in modifications in their own procedures, and ultimately this leads to industrial sickness. And then there are infrastructure bottlenecks. For example, the road connectivity is not good. Many a times transportation through road takes much long than it ideally should take, because of problem with the road connectivity, because of various other issues. For example, many a times riots take place, so the road connectivity gets disturbed. If you talk about hilly areas, because of landslides also the same thing happens. Even the goods which are being sent through railway network, they also reach with significant delays. Not only this, in our ports, Bandargah, where we receive supplies from outside, or where we sell products, where we send products to foreign countries, those ports, there also you find that many a times the consignment gets held up for a number of days. So all these infrastructural bottlenecks basically cause industrial sickness, because now since the supplies are stuck up because of problem with the road connectivity, railway connectivity, or because of being held up in the ports, then naturally the industrial firms will have more requirement for working capital, and they will need to obtain working capital finance from banks, and for that they will have to pay higher rates of interest. So this ultimately causes problem for the industrial enterprises. Many a times when the incoming supplies don't reach on time, then also the production line has to be stopped. That again becomes a problem for the industrial enterprise. Then many a times lack of raw material. Raw material may be available, but it may be of questionable quality. It may not be of good quality. Again, there might be import restrictions, which would mean that the raw material is not available in sufficient quantities. So all these bottlenecks also cause problems for the industrial enterprise. For example, you know that in 2021, many automobile companies in India are facing problems because they used to import raw material. They used to import parts like semiconductors from outside, and because of the corona pandemic and many other issues, this supply of semiconductors has got disrupted, because of which so many companies, automobile companies, they have to either reduce their production volume, they have to many a times also delay the delivery of order to the customer. So these are the problems which are faced by industrial enterprises because of lack of timely availability of good quality raw material. Now let us talk about the internal causes. As I said, internal causes are causes which are under the control of the management, and it is the management which could be blamed for such causes leading to industrial sickness. Now inexperienced promoters, many a times the promoters, those who have started the business enterprise, they do not have sufficient experience, and because of which the enterprise fails. Again, there might be over enthusiastic owners. The owners, the promoters, they are over enthusiastic, so they might invest more than what is actually required. They might overinvest, or they might overinvest in those areas which ultimately do not turn out to be profitable. So this is what happens when the owners are over enthusiastic. They might also believe that there is no risk, while there is significant amount of risk involved in a particular business enterprise or in a particular amount of business decision. So they underestimate the risk, because of which ultimately the industrial enterprises face failure. So these kind of issues can also cause industrial sickness. Then many a times the financial mix is not appropriate. I hope you understand what financial mix is. The proportion of debt and equity in your overall financial mix. This is what we are basically talking about. You might have read about this in financial management, and you know that the ideal debt and equity ratio is 2:1, which means if you are having an equity financing of rupees 100, that is the money which is provided by the owners or the shareholders, you should at most get a loan of rupees 200. You should not go beyond that. You should not try to get a loan of more than rupees 200. So this is what we mean by debt equity financing and debt financing ratio. So the ratio should be around 2:1. The ideal ratio is this. But many a times what happens is there is over reliance on debt, and over reliance on equity also is also not very good. So there is a deviation from this ideal ratio. So this is one reason why the industrial enterprises fail. Then high reliance on costly sources of finance. So many a times companies obtain loans from those sources of finance which are charging them a higher rate of interest. So ideally they should have gone for those sources of finance which charge a lower rate of interest. So they somehow are not able to go to those sources, so they access those sources which require them to pay a higher rate of interest, which means that their interest outgo in expenditure on paying the interest would be much higher, and naturally their profits would reduce. And many a times the borrowing is much less and reliance on own funds, which means the debt equity ratio is much less than 2:1. More of financing is obtained through equity, and there is absolutely no amount of borrowing, absolutely no amount of debt. Even that is not good, because when you obtain debt, when you finance your business using debt, you also get a debt shield, which means your tax payment, your tax liability would be much less if you have also gone for debt. But if you are not borrowing at all, if you are not using debt at all to finance your business, then what will happen? Your tax liability would be higher. So you would not get the advantage of debt shield. So this could also be a problem, and this could also lead to industrial sickness. You have to pay a relatively higher proportion of your profit as taxes. Then many a times there is mismanagement and diversion of funds. For example, Satyam is quoted as a very well-known case of how mismanagement can lead to the enterprise becoming sick. So you can go through the case on internet. You can find out what happened. Satyam basically was in the IT sector and among the top performers in the Indian economy at that point of time. And when the news of mismanagement and diversion of fund came to light, there was a panic among the shareholders, and within a period of months, the share prices reduced to as low as rupees 12 per unit. So this might happen in case of some of the industrial enterprises. Many a times the industrial enterprises do not economize. They do not try to reduce their costs. They do not try to have access to cheaper sources of finance. They do not try to bargain for cheaper raw material sources, and this happens in many cases, including in cases of public sector enterprises, because of which they ultimately become sick. Many a times the industrial enterprises do not build reserves when they have good years, which means when they are earning a lot of profit, they do not save some of this profit as reserves. They do not save some of this profit for future use. I hope you have read about own reserves in financial management. Since they do not keep significant amount of own reserves for future use, what will happen? When in future they want to expand, they will have to go for financing from some banks. So they will have to pay more as interest to those banks, and their interest outgo will increase, which will ultimately impact their profitability. So ideally you should build reserve when you are having good years, when you are earning a lot of profit. What do they do with their profit then? They simply they distribute it among their shareholders as dividends. So this is one problem with many of the industrial enterprises, which ultimately causes sickness. And there are high inventory levels. So the inventory levels are higher than are required. For example, if a particular firm sells 10 cars in a particular month, just to give you a hypothetical example, at most they should have 50 to 60 tires in a particular month. But if they start stocking 1000 tires, so basically they are unnecessarily stocking up inventories, raw material inventories, which basically ties up their money. Now they will require more money to pay for that inventory of 1000 tires. Earlier, because they are basically selling only for 10 cars, which means 50 to 60 cars would have been enough. So they are actually stocking 900 more tires, and they have to actually pay for those tires. So their money is locked up in the excess inventory that they are keeping, they are stocking. Then many a times there is a lack of market research also. Now many of these enterprises, as I've said, because of external causes, internal causes, they do not have sufficient money available with them. They do not have sufficient reserves available with them. So they are not able to go for market research. They are not able to understand the needs of the customer. So their product does not satisfy the customer, and if the product does not satisfy the customer, what will happen? The customer would not purchase the product again and again, and the sales would reduce. Likewise, they are not able to accurately demand the forecast. So many a times their estimation is much less than the demand. So what will happen? They are producing less than what is demanded by the customer. So the customer would switch to some other supplier who can provide him the product in a timely fashion. So this would lead to customer loss also. In case they produce more than the demand, then what will happen? There would be an inventory of unsold items, so there also there could be high inventory levels and the money would remain locked up. So it's very important to forecast the demand accurately, and they're not able to do that because of lack of market research. Many a times they do not invest much in branding also and new product also development also. I hope you know what new product development is, coming up with a new product or service. You have read about this in marketing management. So they are not able to invest in these aspects, so they are not able to invest in innovating, they are not able to invest in bringing up better, more improved products to the market, because of which ultimately they lose out to the competition. They are not able to brand themselves well, so this is an aspect of promotion. They are not able to brand themselves well, which means that the customers are many a times not aware of their presence in the market, or the customers are aware but they do not have the conviction that this is a good quality product that they are selling in the market. So the customers ultimately do not buy their product, sales decline, and because of this decline in sales, the revenues also remain low. And many a times they underestimate competition, since they do not conduct market research. They do not have any idea about the strengths and weaknesses of the competition. They do not forecast, they are not able to forecast the future moves of their competitors, and they are not able to therefore respond to those future moves. They are not able to retaliate against those moves, and ultimately lose out in the race for the market share and ultimately become sick. Now these are the things which generally happen with the public sector enterprises, and they underestimate the competition. Many a times the private sector enterprises overtake them with respect to the market share, and these are the reasons why actually industries become sick. So we have discussed the external as well as the internal causes. Tomorrow in the next session, the last session that we'll be talking about a few more things, but before that let me talk about improper technology use also, which leads to industrial sickness. Many a times now, as we have already discussed, these firms do not have sufficient technology available with them. Since they do not have sufficient monetary resources to spend on technology, so their technology is outdated, obsolete, because of which what might happen, their product may not be of good quality or may not be according to the customer requirements, and they would not be able to sell their products to the customer, or they would not be able to satisfy the customer. Then they do not maintain the machines on a regular basis. In production operations management, you know that there is something called periodic maintenance, and then there is something called predictive maintenance. So they cannot predict as to when their machines might start causing problems, might stop working, or might require maintenance, and because of which they cannot effect maintenance on time, because of which there is a breakdown, and this breakdown ultimately leads to disturbance of the production schedule, and ultimately they are not able to produce items on time, and they are ultimately not able to deliver the items to the customers on time. Again, they do not make use of IT tools, and because of which they do not have any idea about the latest trends in the market or what is happening with their production line. Many a times companies which use IT tools, they can at a click of a mouse tell you how many items they produce on a particular day, or how many items they produce in the last hour, what is the demand in the market, whether they have appropriate supply of raw material or not, whether they have sufficient supply of raw material or not. But if the companies are not using IT tools, they do not have access to such information, because of which they make wrong decisions and ultimately have to suffer, and ultimately they become sick. And as I told you, the reason for use of improper technology is lack of resources. Then many a times the capacity is also underutilized, it remains idle. As I told you in the last slide, because of the lack of raw material, what will happen? The scarcity of raw material will lead to what? Since there is scarcity of raw material, the production line cannot be run throughout the day, it cannot be run for longer duration, and ultimately the production line will have to be stopped in between. So that will lead to idle capacity. So you have your machines, you have the workers manning those machines, but you simply do not have raw material, so the machines are not working and the workers are not working. So this is what we mean by idle capacity. So underutilization or idle capacity. Now what do we mean? Just to give you an example, let's say if on a production line I can produce 100 biscuits in a particular hour, 100 packs of biscuits in a particular hour, but I am producing only 30 because I have not received raw material, right? Or because my machines have stopped because of some maintenance issue. So basically this is underutilization. I am only producing 30 though I could have produced 100. So 30% it's the utilization. Underutilization is to the extent of 70%. Many a times unreliable power supply also leads to underutilization of capacity, because most firms still, including the smaller firms, are still dependent on the electricity supply to run their machines. They do not have their own sources of power. They cannot generate their own power. They cannot generate their own electricity, because of which they have to be dependent on power supply. And if this power supply is unreliable, intermittent, many a times there is no electricity for 2 hours or 3 hours in a particular day, then naturally the machines would not be able to work and the capacity would remain idle. The machines would not be working and the people manning those machines would also not be working. Then many a times lack of skilled manpower is a big problem. We have discussed this in Unit 3, wherein we talked about this aspect as one reason why many of the small scale industries, SSIs, are not able to perform well. So lack of skilled manpower, lack of manpower which knows how to market the product, lack of manpower which knows how to manage the quality of the product, lack of manpower to understand how we can procure raw material or how we can procure finances at a lower price. So such manpower is not easily available to SSIs, naturally because they are not able to pay for such manpower. Naturally because of this, the firms are not able to make the right decision at the right time and they have to lose out in the market. And then one major reason is delayed recognition of impending crisis, which means there is a crisis situation, there is a problem, but these companies are not able to recognize that problem in time. So they are not able to understand from the symptoms that their enterprise might soon become unviable. It might become sick in a near future. So they are not able to understand those symptoms and they are not able to kick in timely corrective action. Fine. For example, if there are losses on a sustained basis, 1 year loss is fine. But if they are incurring losses on a sustained basis for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they simply blame it on recessionary forces or they blame it on their marketing inexperience. But they do not understand that there could be underlying cause behind this. And what will they resort to then? They will resort to increasing credit limits. They will ask their banks or financing agencies from where they are getting their loans to increase their credit limits for higher credit limits. Instead of trying to find out the actual cause could be that the product is not to the liking of the customer, the product does not satisfy the customer. So they are not actually able to understand the underlying cause and they resort to increasing credit limits. Ultimately, since the customer does not like the product, they are still not able to sell their product and the losses that they incur keep on ballooning year after year. So the losses increase and ultimately the enterprise goes sick. It becomes a sick enterprise. So these are the reasons which ultimately lead to industrial sickness. We have discussed the external and the internal causes. Thank you very much for your time.